Okay, so today we're diving into something I think we can all relate to, stress.
Yeah, it's something we all deal with.
For sure. And you've brought us a podcast episode and an article about it. So hopefully by the end of this, we'll have some new tools to add to the stress-busting toolkit.
Definitely. These sources are a great place to start. They really break down what stress is, how it shows up in our lives, and most importantly, how we can manage it.
Love it. No more feeling like that rubber band about to snap.
We can aim for that.
So let's get back to basics. The podcast defines stress as like our body's natural response to a challenge.
Right. It's not always a bad thing.
Right.
A little stress can be a good thing. It can be motivating. It's like a deadline that gets us moving.
For sure.
But you know too much of it, and that's when things can kind of go haywire.
Totally. And it's amazing how much science backs that up. The article I read mentioned a study where they found people in high-stress jobs actually had physical changes in their brain chemistry from like prolonged exposure to cortisol.
Yeah. It's true. When we encounter some kind of threat, a work deadline or a traffic jam, anything like that, our brains think it's fight or flight time.
It's like our bodies didn't get the memo that it's not actually a saber-toothed tiger chasing us.
Exactly. And so it releases cortisol and adrenaline.
Right. Those are the hormones we always hear about.
Yeah. And those are helpful in small doses.
Like if you actually do have to outrun a tiger.
Right. But when it's constant, that's when the trouble really starts.
So if cortisol is like the alarm system and adrenaline is that shot of energy we get to deal with it, it's like our alarm system is always going off.
Exactly. You're exhausted, your body's on high alert, and it starts to impact you both mentally and physically.
And these sources don't sugarcoat the potential consequences either. We're talking increased risk of anxiety, depression, trouble concentrating.
Yeah, and it's not just mental. Chronic stress is linked to heart disease, obesity, even a weakened immune system. It's serious stuff.
It really makes you realize that listening to your body is not just some new agey thing. It's really important.
It's critical. It's your body trying to communicate with you.
Exactly. It's crazy how much our bodies do to try and get our attention.
It really is. And it just goes to show how important it is to really understand how we as individuals cope with that stress.
Yeah, for sure.
The sources talk about both healthy and unhealthy ways we can react.
Oh, definitely. I know I've been guilty of hitting that add to cart button a few too many times when I'm feeling the pressure.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
But I think even just being aware of those tendencies is a big step in the right direction.
Totally. So let's talk about those healthier ways to cope. The podcast mentioned exercise being a natural stress reliever. What's the science behind that?
Well, when we exercise, our bodies release endorphins, those feel-good chemicals,
Okay.
and they actually counteract the effects of those stress hormones we were talking about earlier.
Interesting. So it's like our bodies have their own natural stress-busting mechanism built in.
Exactly.
We just have to activate it. I like it. What about mindfulness? We hear about that a lot these days, but I'm not always sure what that looks like practically.
Mindfulness is really just about being present in the moment.
Yeah.
So it can be as simple as like paying attention to your senses, like really tasting that cup of coffee in the morning or just taking a few minutes to breathe deeply.
Okay.
It's all about finding those pockets of calm in your day.
Yeah, I can see that. And they actually went a bit deeper in the sources. They talked about specific mindfulness techniques, like mindful breathing or even guided meditation. Apparently, there's a ton of research supporting how beneficial those can be for reducing stress.
There is. It's pretty amazing how much evidence there is for these simple practices.
Yeah, so it's not just about feeling better in the moment. It's like actually changing the way our brains respond to stress long term.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered the good. Now, what about those not so healthy coping mechanisms? The ones that feel good in the moment but might not be the best in the long run?
Right. The things we do when we really just want to avoid what's stressing us out. Procrastination, overworking, even just scrolling through social media for hours.
Oh, yeah, been there.
That avoidance tactic, it's something the article called a maladaptive coping strategy.
Which basically means they're not actually helping.
Yeah, exactly. They might provide a temporary escape, but ultimately they can make things worse.
Right. Like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg, it's not actually fixing anything.
Exactly. And in the long run, those unhealthy habits can lead to even worse mental health. They can strain your relationships, even impact your physical health down the line.
Wow. So it's really important to be mindful of those patterns.
It is. And speaking of patterns, one area where this really plays out is in the workplace.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think a lot of us can relate to our jobs being a major source of stress at times.
Absolutely. The article actually listed some of the biggest workplace stressors. Things like unrealistic workloads, a lack of control over your work, even those toxic colleagues.
Ugh, yeah, those are the worst. The podcast actually had this great point from an organizational psychologist who compared unaddressed negativity in the workplace to secondhand smoke.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he said it's just as damaging, leading to burnout and lower productivity for everyone.
Wow. That's powerful. Yeah. And it makes you realize how important it is to create a work environment that actually supports mental well-being.
Right. It's not just about piling on more work. It's about creating a culture where people feel supported.
Exactly. And that means open communication, where employees feel comfortable talking about their workload or any challenges they might be facing, and having support systems in place, whether it's access to mental health resources or just building a sense of camaraderie among team members.
It's interesting because we often focus on the individual stressors, but what you're highlighting is how important that bigger picture is, that organizational approach.
It's both. You need both individual coping strategies and a supportive environment.
Right. And that leads us to another connection, the link between stress and anxiety. While they're not the same thing, chronic stress can open the door for some more serious anxiety disorders.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's like if stress hangs around too long, it can actually increase your risk of developing something more serious, like generalized anxiety disorder or even PTSD.
Yeah, and the article actually highlights this study where they found that people who had a lot of chronic stress were way more likely to develop some kind of anxiety disorder down the line.
Which really shows how important it is to deal with stress head-on.
Absolutely. Early intervention is key, especially when it comes to mental health.
Because it's got to be so much easier to manage if you catch it early on.
Exactly, before it snowballs into something bigger.
And the good news is we're not powerless. There's a lot we can do. In fact, our sources actually talked about building resilience as a way to combat this, which sounds kind of amazing.
Yeah.
So what exactly is resilience? Is it something we can actually learn?
Resilience is really interesting. It's not about avoiding stress altogether because, honestly, who can do that?
Right. Life happens.
Exactly. So it's more about learning how to bounce back from challenges, to deal with those tough times without letting them completely throw you off track.
Okay, so it's like we're building up our mental and emotional, I don't know, shock absorbers or something.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And the good news is, yeah, it's definitely something we can develop. It's like a muscle we can strengthen over time.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what's the workout routine for building resilience? Where do we even begin?
Well, they actually shared a cool story in the podcast episode about this group of firefighters who went through resilience training after they had this really tough experience.
Oh, wow.
And one of the most helpful things they learned was something called cognitive reframing.
Cognitive reframing? That sounds kind of complicated.
It's not as bad as it sounds.
Yeah.
Basically, it's about recognizing and then challenging those negative thought patterns that pop up when you're stressed.
Oh, okay, I get it.
So instead of immediately going to, I can't handle this, it's about saying, okay, this is tough, but what's one thing I can do right now? Shifting your perspective from feeling overwhelmed to focusing on what you have control over.
So it's about hitting the reset button on those thoughts and choosing a more empowering story.
Exactly. Yeah. And another big one is something we've touched on a bit already, that power of connection.
Right, having that community, that support system.
It makes a huge difference. And the research backs this up. The article mentions several studies that showed having strong social connections is one of the biggest factors in building resilience.
It makes you realize how connected everything really is. Our thoughts, our bodies, our environment, our relationships, they all impact how we experience and manage stress.
They really do.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is we have more power than we think. By understanding how stress works and having those healthy coping strategies and a good support system, we can handle pretty much anything life throws at us.
This deep dive has been amazing. I feel like we went from feeling stressed about stress to actually having a plan.
That's what we like to hear.
So for everyone listening, next time you feel that stress start to bubble up, remember, you've got this. You have the tools and the knowledge to navigate it. And hey, maybe even use it to your advantage.
Now that's resilience in action.
Exactly. All right, that's it for this deep dive on stress. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating conversation.